Welcome to Storied Ground, a Northwest Ohio history podcast, where we enlist our region's many historical markers as our guides to rediscovering the presence of the past around us in all its wonder, diversity, and complexity. I'm your host, Nick Pavlik. In the heart of the City of Defiance, Ohio, the Defiance Public Library stands at the western edge of Old Fort Defiance Park, overlooking the confluence of the Maumee and Auglaize Rivers. Having once been occupied by Fort Defiance, a military outpost built by General Anthony Wayne in 1794, the park grounds have long been recognized as a historic site. No fewer than 15 historical markers have been erected throughout the area. But there is another far less conspicuous marker on this site that speaks to an entirely different but also consequential chapter in the history of these grounds: the founding of the Defiance Public Library. At the base of the American flag that stands outside the library's west wing, a decorative stone is engraved with a quotation reading, "A library outranks any other one thing a community can do to benefit its people." The engraving then names the author of these words: the Gilded Age industrialist Andrew Carnegie. One of the richest Americans in history, Carnegie ascended from impoverished origins to become a tycoon of the American steel industry in the late 19th century, and achieved notoriety just as much for his extreme wealth as for his rather ruthless business practices. But Carnegie was also a dedicated philanthropist. By the end of his life, he had given 90% of his fortune away to charities, foundations, universities, and, perhaps most famously, public libraries. Carnegie's unparalleled support for the establishment of public libraries in his own time was one of his most enduring contributions to American culture, and it is this philanthropic legacy that he is perhaps best remembered for today. It is not hyperbolic to suggest that the development of the renowned public library system we enjoy today in the United States can be attributed in no small part to Andrew Carnegie. Having himself relied on public libraries for his own edification as a young man, Carnegie believed fervently in the value public libraries provide to their communities, and made them a major focus of his philanthropic enterprise. Between 1886 and 1917, Carnegie's money helped fund the building of over 1,600 public libraries across America, many of them in small towns that might otherwise not have been able to afford establishing their own public library building. These libraries are collectively designated as Carnegie Libraries, and there are over 100 of them across the state of Ohio, including the Defiance Public Library here at Old Fort Defiance Park. Now listed on the National Registry of Historic Places, the Defiance Public Library has been a beloved fixture of the Defiance community since its opening in 1905. In this episode of Storied Ground, we're paying a visit to the Defiance Public Library to discover what the unique history and architecture of one Carnegie Library in a rural Northwest Ohio community can tell us about the wider legacy of Carnegie Libraries in America. To situate the Defiance Public Library within the historical context of the Carnegie Library era, I was delighted to have the opportunity to speak with one of the foremost experts on the architectural history of Carnegie Libraries.
My name's Abigail Van Slyck. I'm the Dayton Professor Emerita of Art History and Architectural Studies at Connecticut College. I'm an architectural historian with an interest in libraries and the spaces of childhood.
Dr. Abigail Van Slyck is the author of the book Free to All: Carnegie Libraries and American Culture, 1890 to 1920, published by the University of Chicago Press. As an architectural historian, she is an expert in interpreting the cultural meanings embedded within our built environments. It was while earning her doctorate at the University of California, Berkeley, that Dr. Van Slyck became interested in the architectural history of one of the most ubiquitous civic institutions in America that had still never really been the subject of serious architectural study: small-town public libraries, especially Carnegie Libraries.
So I was raised in the suburbs of Detroit, in a suburb that had a beautiful modernist library designed by Marcel Breuer. I'd never seen a Carnegie library. And then I went to school in the East, and there are not that many Carnegie libraries in the East because there were earlier public libraries built. And so when I went to California, I wanted to see what California was like. And so we would get in the car on the weekends and we'd go and drive to farm service towns, go out into the countryside and find these little towns. And every place we went, there was these Carnegie libraries. And so whereas if I'd grown up in a town with a Carnegie library, I think I would have said, oh yeah, there's another Carnegie library. But because I didn't, they were new to me and they seemed to be ubiquitous. And I thought, how is it that these buildings are all over the place and I've never heard of them? I've never read about them. No architectural historian has bothered to talk about them at all.
As Dr. Van Slyck discovered, it is impossible to separate the history of Carnegie libraries from the biography of the controversial figure with whom they will forever be deeply intertwined, Andrew Carnegie.
So Carnegie started life in a very modest way. He was born in Scotland in 1835. His father was a linen weaver at a time in which linen weaving was being mechanized. And so his father was not thriving in his work. And when Carnegie was about 13, his entire family immigrated to Pennsylvania. They had family there already, so they sort of had a social network where they could land. And Carnegie went to work as a boy. And he was a telegraph operator, and he worked on the railroad. So very much a self-made man. A huge part of his success was that he figured out the principle of cost accounting. And so when he was working on the railroad, he could calculate exactly how much it would cost to carry a passenger from point A to point B. He could then drop the fare down to just above that level. His competitors, who didn't do the same math, would simply try to undercut him, and they would drive themselves out of business. And then he could raise the rates again and make some money. So he was really very engaged in trying to figure out how systems worked and to really maximize those and make the most of them. He made most of his money in steel, and he eventually sold out, and what became U.S. Steel was initially his company. So he's attracted to libraries for a number of reasons. One, he always told the story that when he was a boy in Allegheny City, Pennsylvania, which is now part of Pittsburgh, a local man named Colonel Anderson, a well-to-do man, once a week he would open his personal library to the working boys of the neighborhood so that they could go in and read and better themselves. And so, Carnegie's not in school. He's self-taught, everything he does. And so he always talked about how important that was, and I think he thought of this as a way of sort of paying back Colonel Anderson. At the same time, he's following in the footsteps of other men of wealth who would donate cultural institutions to their hometowns as a way of doing good to their communities, but also as a way of indicating their own level of culture. And so I think for someone like Carnegie, who's not well educated formally, that had a lot of resonance, that he was cultured enough that he could give cultural institutions. And then I think a really key part of this as well is that Carnegie was living at a time when there was a very great concern over what was called indiscriminate charity. There was a worry that if you gave money to the poor in the wrong way, you would undermine their willingness to work hard and to better themselves. They called it pauperization. You might turn people into paupers by giving them money. And so a library is the perfect solution to that. As Carnegie said, the idea here is to help only those who will help themselves. And so a library doesn't do you any good unless you go into it, unless you read, unless you actually use it. And so another part of this is very much thinking, yeah, I can help people, but I need to help the right kind of people. And what he meant was people who were willing to put in the effort to read, to learn, to better themselves.
Carnegie's philosophy regarding the purpose of public libraries was clearly steeped in the values of self-reliance and self-improvement that were so foundational to 19th century American culture. And as the 20th century approached, he devised a revolutionary system of corporatized philanthropic giving that, in his view, would provide untold numbers of ordinary citizens with opportunities for self-improvement by creating thousands of new public libraries in communities across America and other parts of the world.
Early on in his giving, he's acting very much like other 19th century philanthropists. He's giving fairly lavish gifts to communities where he has some connection. Either it's where he grew up once he immigrated to the U.S., or towns where he had steel plants. You could see the direct connection there. And he was maybe, giving one library every 2 years or something like that. And then at the end of the 19th century, he decides to scale up. And so he begins to actually put together a system to allow this scaling up to happen. He lets it be known that he's willing to give a grant to any community in the United States under certain conditions. That the community had to provide a site for the building. The community had to tax itself at a rate of 10% of whatever his gift was going to be. And that community money would go to buying books, keeping the lights on, keeping the building heated, and paying for the librarian. And again, this is another way of helping those who help themselves, right? That the community has to also contribute, right? So after 10 years, right, a community would have matched whatever Carnegie had put into it, and the anticipation was that that would continue on and on and on. And so there was a form that you filled out, and it also, your town couldn't be too small because you had to have enough population that you could actually raise enough tax funding to actually support the building, right? And then there was some sort of formula for something like $2 per person would help establish the size of the grant that he would give. And so he asks his personal secretary, James Bertram, to essentially run this thing, and the letters start to pour in. And he begins to give hundreds of grants every year. And so over the course of his lifetime, he ends up giving over 1,600 library buildings in the United States and over 2,500 worldwide, because he also gives throughout the English-speaking world.
And one of the communities that appealed to Carnegie for funding toward a new public library building was Defiance, Ohio.
The city applied for a Carnegie grant in 1902 and received it in 1904.
So it was $22,000 they got in the Carnegie grant. It was $17,500 that they got in November of 1903, and then another $4,500 they got the following year.
That's the Defiance Public Library's Cara Potter and Taryn Lawson.
My name's Cara Potter, and I'm the director of the Defiance Public Library System. The mission of the Defiance Public Library System is that the system welcomes all and provides accessible books and other resources to its users. The library system brings people together to learn about the past, present, and future. So that's the formal mission statement. I would paraphrase it informally as we try and be the best library system as we can to our community. And our main library is a Carnegie building in downtown Defiance.
And I'm Taryn Lawson. I'm the communications coordinator for Defiance Public Library System's 3 library locations.
Like so many Carnegie libraries in small towns across America, the origins of the Defiance Public Library actually stretch back decades before the construction of a permanent Carnegie Library building, beginning with a subscription fee-based library that catered more to the city's elite, and culminating in advocacy efforts on the part of local residents for the city to establish a free public library for the entire community.
So before the public library, there was the Defiance Library Association, which was founded in 1877. The association charged a fee to get access to the library, which was $5. That's about $129 today. They moved around into several small rooms. And in 1895, the Library Association donated the books it owned, which were about 400 books, to the city on the condition that the city create a free public library. The 400 books that were donated were mostly fiction, and a good portion of those were in German. There was a big German community here at the time. So the library went ahead and did that. It formed a little free library. First it was in a room in the courthouse, and then it moved to several different places.
It just so happened that at the turn of the 20th century, as the City of Defiance sought to find a more permanent location for its public library, Andrew Carnegie had begun to dramatically scale up his giving to help communities across the country build their own public library buildings.
Defiance Democrat, February 21, 1903. J.F. Frost submits a communication on how Defiance can easily secure a public library building and urges that a united effort be made to secure the same. The communication follows.
I read with a good deal of interest your editorial in Monday's issue of the Crescent News, in which you point out the need of Defiance people making a united effort for every enterprise that will aid in building up our city. I heartily agree with the Crescent News that is the only way any community can hope to prosper. There is a matter of great public interest to our city that I very much wish the Crescent News would push along. That is a public library building. I have not a particle of doubt that if the matter was placed before Mr. Andrew Carnegie in the proper shape, that he could be induced to furnish money for the erection of one that would be a credit to our city. We would, of course, be compelled to furnish a suitable location for the building, and surely no more lovely spot could be found than the Old Fort Ground that now belongs to our city. Defiance is poor and burdened with debt and unable to erect such a building as should adorn a location of such great beauty. Therefore, let us place the needs of our city, the beauty of the location we can offer, the historic incidents connected therewith before Mr. Andrew Carnegie, and ask him to erect thereon a building that would do honor to that sacred location. Let us work together in this matter, and I feel sure success will crown our efforts.
Defiance successfully applied for Carnegie funding. And as Dr. Van Slyck had mentioned, Carnegie's funding came with certain conditions to which the City of Defiance was beholden in order to ensure the long-term sustainability of the new library building.
There were two stipulations with the Carnegie that I think was interesting. They had to provide a site for the library, which makes sense, but the other one is they had to pass an ordinance for the purchase of books and future maintenance through taxation. So there had to be that commitment to maintain what was being built.
Yeah, the maintenance was $1,750 a year.
Daily Crescent News, November 13th, 1903. The fact that Defiance may secure a Carnegie-free public library has been given an impetus which should thrill the hearts of every citizen who favors the advancement of the city's interests and the development of a more extensive Bureau of Information. The former boards and the present Board of Trustees of the Defiance Free Public Library have been endeavoring for some time to secure from Andrew Carnegie a gift for the construction of a free public library. But no encouragement was ever received until last Sunday, when Professor Mitchell received from Mr. Carnegie a blank question sheet which was filled out in details and returned to the sender. Mr. Carnegie took immediate notice of the same, and yesterday the following letter was received.
Professor R.W. Mitchell, Defiance, Ohio. Dear Sir, schedule with information about library received. You state that you believe the Council will support a library by levy of 1 mil. Evidently, Council has not been approached. Before Mr. Carnegie can consider such applications, a direct official proposition should be made. How much will a 1 mil levy realize for support of library annually? Respectfully yours, James Bertram, Private Secretary to Andrew Carnegie.
The significance of the above letter can be readily seen, and thus it is apparent why the public should stand solidly at the back of the Council and support their action to levy 1 mil. Every cent put into this library enterprise by the City of Defiance would be an investment for the benefit of every citizen for all time to come. It is to be earnestly hoped that the citizens and council will act in unison with these gentlemen and secure for Mr. Carnegie a gift for the construction of a library building. Defiance Democrat, December 11th, 1903. Andrew Carnegie has favored Defiance by granting a $17,500 free public library building to this city. The exactions of Mr. Carnegie are a levy of less than $1 million a year and the providing of a suitable site. In answer to the ordinances recently passed pledging a $1 million levy, the following letter was received last evening.
November 25, 1903. R.W. Mitchell, Esquire, Superintendent, City Schools, Defiance, Ohio. Dear Sir, responding to your communications on behalf of Defiance, if the city agrees by resolution of council to maintain a free public library at cost of no less than $1,750 a year and provide a suitable site for the building, Mr. Carnegie will be pleased to furnish $17,500 to erect a free public library building for Defiance. Respectfully yours, James Bertram, Private Secretary, Andrew Carnegie.
Architects John F. Wing and Marshall S. Mahurin of Fort Wayne, Indiana, were commissioned to design the new Defiance Public Library building, on which construction began in 1904.
Daily Crescent News, August 8, 1904. On Saturday evening, the trustees of the Free Library let the contract for the construction of the Carnegie Library to P.A. Baker, F.J. Baker, and Jacob Baltus of the city for $17,000. The building will be erected on the fort ground, and the contractors will begin work at once. The plans drawn by the architects Wing and Mahurin of Fort Wayne will be carried out and when completed will show one of the most beautiful, ornate, and convenient libraries ever constructed for that sum of money. The exterior will be of Gothic architecture, built of the Mansfield variegated sandstone of the same beautiful colors used in the Presbyterian Church at Napoleon, which has been seen and admired by many of our citizens. The roof will be of red tile. It is a matter of congratulation that the contract fell into the hand of a firm of local contractors, they being the lowest bidders, as the result will be that the labor of construction will be practically all performed by our own citizens, and the cost thereof distributed among our own people.
So they actually constructed it in 1 year, which was surprising given how long things take to get put together today. They broke ground in 1904 and they opened the front doors almost exactly a year later. And they did a local fundraiser to do the landscaping, so that was about $1,000. So I haven't figured out what these all are in today's money, but I'm sure it's more than $1,000.
Carnegie's library building program was revolutionary not just for its unprecedented scale, but also for ushering in the standardization of the design of public library buildings, and for prioritizing the functionally practical building plans long advocated for by the American library profession, rather than the design predilections of architects, which often put aesthetic form before practical function.
The 19th century philanthropists who had given libraries to their communities had typically hired an architect, built the library, and then once the library was completed, hired the librarian. The librarian often came in and said, "Oh my goodness, this is not a very well-designed library for library purposes." And some of my favorite libraries are not good for library purposes. Those built by H.H. Richardson, which have beautiful double-height book halls, which are just stunningly beautiful rooms. And librarians hated them. They were exhausting to the librarian to have to go and fetch books from upper levels, and there was no way to heat the library at the ground level without overheating the books at the top and essentially turning them into dust. So one of the things that Carnegie did that was revolutionary was that he listened to librarians about what the library should look like, primarily what the plan would look like. He didn't care as much about what it looked like on the outside. So eventually they begin to ask communities to send their plans in for review. And Bertram writes scathing letter after scathing letter after scathing letter about, this is too pretentious, this is too much architecture, this is not good for library purposes. You seem to be trying to get a social hall instead of a library, back and forth. Fascinating reading those letters. And eventually Bertram creates a little document. It's called Notes on the Erection of Library Buildings. And in it he has little sketch plans of what libraries of different sizes and different site configurations would look like. And he would say, here, follow these. And so it revolutionized what libraries were like. Completely gone are those beautiful double-height book halls. And instead you have one level. You've got bookcases that most adults could reach books without recourse to a ladder. You have people sitting amongst the books. There's a way in which these are libraries that actually welcome the reader in a relationship of trust. Not completely without the observation of a librarian seated at a central delivery desk, but nonetheless really welcoming readers in and letting them interact with the books directly.
The Defiance Public Library was built several years before the publication of Bertram's pamphlet, and before communities had to have their library building plans approved in order to receive Carnegie funding. Both its plan and design are therefore replete with certain features that divert from the later Carnegie standardizations, lending it a truly unique character relative to many other Carnegie Library buildings.
This is one of the libraries. This one was actually built before the requirement. Eventually, Carnegie's secretary put in a requirement that there would be building plans submitted. But that actually did not exist at the time of this one. And so this one has a whole host of really unique characteristics, and that glass skylight is one of them. It's unique because of that, in part.
Lawson is referring to the beautiful glass skylight that adorns the domed ceiling of the Defiance Public Library's central rotunda. The library's original building plan also differed from the standard rectangular plans later espoused by Bertram, though it still comprised many of the hallmark public service-oriented features that would have rendered it recognizable as a Carnegie library.
At that time, the building was in a T shape. So on one part of the T, on the left part of the T, there was a children's reading room. On the right side, there was an adult reading room. And then at the top, there is a general large reading room that overlooks the Maumee River. And in the basement, there was a janitor's apartment. The janitor lived in the library. And that's partially because at that time it was heated with wood, and somebody needed to be there to take care of keeping the heating going.
It was also ahead of its time in providing open access stacks to the Defiance community, something that later became a standard feature of Carnegie Library buildings.
So one thing that was unusual about this library from the beginning is that the public had open access to the books. It wasn't a closed stack building, so that was very unusual for that time period.
And regarding the janitor who lived in the library's building, he was the grandfather of a young Defiance boy named Bill Davison, who would go on to become the world-famous and celebrated jazz cornetist, better known as Wild Bill Davison.
Oh yes, he used to play right down there. He played and liked the sound over the water, so he would play down at the river.
His grandfather's name was John Henry Krebs. So he and his wife lived, they were the first custodians of the building. They lived in the basement apartment, and at some point Wild Bill came and lived with them as a child, and he went on to bigger and better things in his life. And Mr. Krebs actually passed away in the library building. So staff for many decades have maintained that his ghost is here in the building.
We had a murder mystery that was the ghost of John Henry Krebs. Mystery.
Yeah.
So he's the library ghost.
Yeah,
He's one of them.
Okay.
Yeah. So the staff have claimed books have fallen off the shelf, lights have gone on and off unexpectedly, things have...
The toilet paper roll in the bathroom is spinning, I heard. I didn't hear it, but I've heard that.
But these stories have been ongoing for a long time.
Sure.
Because of course they are. It's an old, cool, historic building. So
Yes.
it's just what we do.
There's always going to be ghost stories.
Yeah.
What would a library be without a ghost?
Exactly.
In addition to being the home of two future legends, one in the pantheon of great American jazz musicians, and the other in local Defiance folklore, the Defiance Public Library was also distinguished among many Carnegie Library buildings for its unique exterior design. Though neither Carnegie nor Bertram stipulated a standard exterior design for libraries built with Carnegie funds, many Carnegie Library buildings were enveloped in exterior designs heavily influenced by the classical tradition.
So it's fascinating to think back to this Allegheny City Library, one of the first ones that Carnegie donated to his hometown. And it very much looks to what H.H. Richardson had been doing in the East. It's a Romanesque revival building. It's got medieval motifs incorporated into the building. It has a big tower. And as Carnegie moved to put his money where librarians' mouths were, to actually building libraries that librarians would approve of, he began to, they developed these little floor plans which actually lent themselves to the classical vocabulary. They lent themselves to a temple front motif for the library. And it happens at the same time that the American architectural profession is going through some really interesting changes. They are trying to establish themselves as a recognized profession, and a recognized profession has a theory base that they master, and that's how you prove that you're a professional. And so it's a time in which American architects have really embraced classicism as the theoretical basis for their work. And so there's sort of the convergence of a couple of factors that end up making so many Carnegie libraries come forth in this kind of classical garb.
The exterior of the original Defiance Public Library building, however, is of an entirely different architectural tradition, one that has a warmer and more domestic quality to it.
It's called Tudor Revival. I love it very much.
It features decorative half-timbering, a steeply pitched roof, small window panes, narrow windows, and parapets. And it's built of a beautiful red sandstone, further distinguishing it from the many Carnegie libraries with white marble and granite exteriors that hearken to the classical style.
It's from Mansfield, Ohio. There was a quarry there at the time that had red variegated sandstone. And since then the quarry's closed, so we're one of the very few buildings in Ohio that have the sandstone exterior.
The library exterior is also adorned with certain stylistic flourishes that celebrate beauty for its own sake, and therefore wouldn't have been approved in later Carnegie Library designs, such as stained glass windows, and 2 ornamental lamps mounted on either side of the library's main front entrance. These lamps were gifted to the library by the City Federation of Women's Clubs in 1913, and take the form of 2 torches being held aloft by ornately armored hands. Although,
if you go up to the exterior front doors and you look, there's hands coming out holding, and I didn't notice this until last year, but they're 2 left hands.
It is 2 left hands. That's true. It would be nice if it was.
Probably can't launch a fundraising campaign just to
switch the hand around. Give us a hand. I got the tagline already.
There you go. Maybe you can.
Yeah.
you could say the 2 left hands only lend yet more character to the Defiance Public Library building, which accomplishes a rare architectural feat of conveying its own uniquely captivating style and design, while at the same time fitting in with the overall form that is unmistakably that of a Carnegie library.
My first library job was at Boston Public Library, and that's a building was built by McKim, Mead and White, and they were students, or actually White was a student of H.H. Richardson, who designed a lot of the Carnegie buildings. So this one, as you said, isn't exactly a Carnegie library, but it's close enough that when I walked into it, I felt like I was at home.
It's a wonderful building. It's a beauty and very unusual.
Dr. Van Slyck agrees.
It's fascinating to see a building that does something so differently. I mean, its overall form, in terms of just its massing, its 3-dimensional forms, very similar. You could dress it up in almost any style you want. And so what I love about the Defiance Library is that, first of all, it reminds us that all of those classical buildings, that was a choice. Right? That it wasn't an inevitability, that each and every time someone built a Carnegie Library, they were making decisions about what the building should look like and what they were trying to communicate through that building. I also love the fact that I struggle to actually come up with one clear style name for the Defiance Library. And that's one of the things that I love about architecture, right? It's a cultural phenomenon. It's not like bird watching, where there are, you should be able to figure out what that bird is. the architect could do anything and pull any combination of forms together. And so that one it's sort of homey. It has sort of a domestic quality to it. It's clearly referencing the arts in so many ways, the stained glass and the beautiful dome. I think the other thing worth saying is that once Carnegie, through his secretary, James Bertram, began to really try to have some influence over what the buildings looked like, you would not have gotten that building built. Because they wanted everything to go toward the most effective library organization possible, and they didn't want to spend extra money on beauty, really. Which is very funny. They talked about wanting to build buildings and not so much architecture. And so that beautiful dome and the stained glass and even the way you climb, right, up to the main level. Later buildings were simpler and really focused on library function.
In funding the construction of the Defiance Public Library, Andrew Carnegie's philanthropy was transformative, bestowing the community with its own institutional symbol of modern American civic and cultural life, as well as an architectural landmark that quickly became the most recognizable building in Defiance. But not all communities welcomed the idea of a Carnegie Library. In some cities, the prospect of receiving money from Andrew Carnegie ignited fierce opposition from residents for whom Carnegie represented the oppression of the working class.
Probably the biggest issue in many communities was how Carnegie made his money. So there was a concern that the money, in their terms, was tainted, that he had earned his money on the backs of workers. He notoriously, violently put down a strike at the steelworks in Homestead, Pennsylvania. And so he had once had a reputation as being a friend of the working man. He pretty much lost that reputation during the Homestead strikes. So in many communities where there was a strong labor movement, there was this notion that they didn't want the money under any circumstances, that it was tainted, that it sullied them by accepting Carnegie's money.
Another point of contention in some communities was the increased tax burden that a Carnegie Library would impose.
The requirements that Carnegie put into place meant that if you were a city like Detroit and you were going to get a really big grant from Carnegie, it meant that it would come with a really big tax implication. And so you know that not everybody agrees on how much tax we should all pay. And so those were conversations as well.
And in some communities, debates centered not on the question of whether a Carnegie Library should be built, but rather where in town the library should be located.
There were smaller skirmishes in various communities because the community did have to provide the site. And so sometimes there was a push to just take a free site, if they could get one that somebody would give them. But then there was also this idea that the location of the library said something about that town. And so often they wanted them sort of visible, but sort of not part of the commercial realm, but more towards the domestic, the neighborhoody kind of town. Some towns really saw a Carnegie Library as a great tool to attract new residents, right? This is a time in which the railroads have just gone across the country. There's new towns springing up. And if you could have a really visible, nice library, that was a way of saying we're a respectable town. You should move here. You should invest your money. You should buy our land. You should, join us. And so in some towns, there would be a debate about how visible did you want the library to be from the railroad station, for instance.
Defiance was one such community where public opinion was divided on the best site for the new Carnegie Library.
From what I can tell from reading the newspapers at the time, there was a long public conversation about where the library should be located. One place was in Triangle Park, which is on the other end of Clinton Street, close to where the 1918 high school is. And the other option was here at the fort grounds. So it's hard to tell exactly why they made that decision, but in the articles in the newspaper, It was mentioned that they placed the library here because this was actually not a very good part of town at the time. There was still a lot of commercial boat traffic, which created a lot of smells and noise and trash, and the fort grounds were overgrown at the time.
To the members of the City Council from the 2nd Ward of Defiance, Ohio, gentlemen, we, the undersigned women and patrons of the public library and residing in the said ward, most emphatically object to and protest against the location of the Free Library building to be built at the Old Fort Ground, and for good and sufficient reasons.
To the editor, thus far the arguments in public print concerning the Carnegie Library site have been chiefly in favor of the Old Fort grounds. There are hundreds of people in Defiance who, by their signatures, have expressed their disapproval of the Old Fort grounds as a library site. I desire to say at the outset that I am one of the aforesaid disapprovers for good reasons. Someone has urged that the fort grounds are centrally located. This needs no discussion, as a glance at the plat of the Defiance of today shows this claim to be erroneous to a palpable degree. At no point do the streetcars come nearer to the fort ground than 6 squares. Why compel our citizens to walk half a mile in the heat of the summer, the icy blasts of winter, or the darkness of the night, away from the streetcar line? I might also refer to the impropriety of having such an institution in a remote, isolated place where perhaps timid persons would be loath to go. In my opinion, the city prison site, available without a doubt, economically kept, centrally located, easy of access, desirable from every point of view, would be an excellent home for Carnegie's gift. A second warder.
Defiance Democrat, December 4, 1903. To the editor. There are several reasons why the site of the prospective public library building should soon be chosen. That the question may be presented for the consideration of all concerned, I offer the following reasons why the Fort Park should be the place selected. For its removal from the noise and dust of business, its central location and ready access from both sides of both rivers, its size, affording ample lawn independent of the fort earthworks, its removal from danger of injury by fire in neighboring buildings, its being the property of the city and its freedom from other buildings, present and prospective. From economy of supervision, the Fort Park requires more care and police oversight than it has received. This could be given by the caretaker of the library building, who should dwell in the building. The Fort Park is worthy of a good monument, and none could be more appropriate than a good public library building. Charles E. Slocum.
For thousands of years, this point was the gathering place for the Indian tribes in northwest Ohio, because it was at the confluence of the Auglaize and the Maumee.
It's sometimes considered a very sacred place where
Yes.
the two rivers come
And
together.
the Tiffin River, too. So when the Europeans came here, the English built a supply post here, which fell into disrepair. And then during the Indian Wars, Anthony Wayne built another supply post here that he used for about, 2 years at the most. So yes, if you walk along the fort grounds, there's multiple markers all around. And I think that after the Civil War, the historic community in Defiance built a replica of the fort here. And that's what fell into disrepair before the Carnegie Library was in place. So they placed it here with the idea that it would be an improvement to the neighborhood. And it was. When the library construction started, they cleaned the fort grounds up again, and it's been a city park since then.
Construction of the Defiance Public Library at the Old Fort grounds was completed in the spring of 1905. And on July 4th of that year, the Defiance Public Library officially opened to the community, under the direction of librarian Jewel Folk.
Defiance Crescent News, July 5, 1905. Sunshine and shadows danced and played, an occasional raindrop fell here and there upon the heads of those assembled in a large crowd. A cool, continuous wind from the southwest stirred the trees throughout the whole day, but not a thing occurred that marred the ceremonies yesterday in the dedication of the Carnegie Public Library. The reading and general library rooms were thoroughly inspected by the people, and none went away dissatisfied. It was as if the entire affair was without a blemish. If there is a part that is not in accordance with the best ideas, both in architecture and art, none could detect it. The greatest and grandest library in the country seemed to be the prevailing sentiment among all who saw the elegant structure. Last night the edifice was lighted up, and the picture that it made on the darkness was finer than any artist can print. Hundreds of people again visited the Temple of Wisdom last evening. The Carnegie Public Library is now dedicated. It belongs to the people. It is home for the reader and the student, the pride of every Defiance citizen. It is an everlasting home of greatness and education, a perpetual sanctuary of knowledge, a house beautiful that is a monument to education and culture. The library will be open for the circulation of books on Saturday. Miss Jewel Folk, the librarian, is now in charge.
Folk's tenure as librarian coincided with a significant transformation in the labor composition of American librarianship. While most professional librarian positions in the 19th century were occupied by men, at the turn of the 20th century, librarianship became one of the few occupations where women were increasingly appointed to professional or even managerial positions. And as Dr. Van Slyck notes, the feminization of librarianship is yet another major change in American library history that is closely linked with the advent of Carnegie libraries.
It's a beautiful opportunity to read buildings, to see exactly how that all worked. So I was surprised when I started this work to learn that librarianship had been completely a male profession in the 19th century. I was so accustomed to librarianship as a feminized profession that this took me by surprise. And then I looked at the plan of the Allegheny City Carnegie Library, and there is a private office for the librarian that has direct access into the men's toilet. And that told me a very important thing, that they never ever imagined when they were building that building in the late 1880s that the librarian would be a woman. And so that is one sign of how staunchly male the profession was. But in some ways, Carnegie drove the growth of the profession, because if you're building hundreds of libraries, you need hundreds of librarians. And in many of these communities, they were looking for cheap labor, and educated women were cheap labor. So part of it's an economic idea that you can actually make your library budget go farther if you hire a woman. And so librarians, the men who are at the height of the profession, really leading the profession, began to articulate what was essentially a two-tiered system. That it was understood that men would be the directors of large urban systems. They would have private offices. They would have staff that they would direct. They were the CEO of the library, as you were. And that women could work within those large buildings as clerks of all different kinds. That they would be appropriate to actually head up the running of a branch library. And that in many small towns, it was accepted that a woman could be the librarian of a small town library. And so that is the way the library profession thought about how you introduce women.
Both the history and design of the Defiance Public Library reflect how the vast proliferation of new public libraries, many of them Carnegie libraries, in small towns across America during the early 20th century, led to an unprecedented number of female librarians assuming positions of leadership in the profession. From the beginning, with one exception from 2018 to 2019, the Defiance Public Library has been led by women.
The first librarian was Jewel Folk, and she was here from 1895 to 1914, and then she came back for a period after that. She actually died penniless, and she's buried in Riverside Cemetery. She had her grave wasn't marked until last year. The Defiance Friends of the Library purchased a headstone for her, so we're very happy that we were able to do that for her.
As the Defiance Public Library's first director, Jewel Folk presided over the library during a period when the American library profession was embroiled in a debate over how public libraries should respond to the rising popularity of fiction. In the 19th century, the predominantly male library profession had largely derided popular fiction as frivolous or even morally harmful reading that was not worthy of gracing library shelves. But at the dawn of the 20th century, more and more female librarians, including Jewel Folk, began to argue that public libraries had a responsibility to serve all members of their communities by also providing access to the books that most residents actually wanted to read, rather than just the books librarians had traditionally thought they should read. And in small rural towns like Defiance, what many residents wanted to read was popular fiction. In her annual report to the Defiance Public Library Board of Directors for the year 1896, Jewel Folk stated,
"In selecting books for the library, we have to remember that the public owns its public library, and the people will use a library not because in others' opinion they ought to, but because they like to, and the only test of this liking is its use. This year's experience proves that that which is most in demand is recreative reading. For to the masses of the people, hard-worked and living humdrum lives, the novel comes as an open door to an ideal life, in the enjoyment of which one may forget for a time the hardships or the tedium of the real, and to the many it comes as their only educational opportunity. It is the purpose of a public library to create in them the habit of reading and gradually develop a taste and desire for the very best."
Folk's report anticipated a future in which popular fiction was an essential component of public library collections. But it also reinforced the still prevailing attitudes of librarians in the early 20th century that while popular fiction may be appropriate for some libraries, it should ultimately serve to provide readers towards a better class of books, books that were deemed more useful, uplifting, or educational.
Defiance Democrat, December 11, 1903. Our efficient librarian, Miss Jewel Folk, tells us that the one thing most needed is more books, in answer to the question, how many volumes are there in the library? Miss Folk gave the following reply.
The public library is fortunate in having but very few books of the class technically known as dead books on its shelves, owing to the very obvious reason that in selecting books for this institution, the librarian studies her public and is governed mainly by its needs, expressed or anticipated. Study clubs are looked after, the lists of required reading in the public schools are consulted, the latest books on subjects of vital interest, books in which the live topics of the day are carefully discussed and criticized, are a leading feature. And it is a matter of congratulation that this class of literature is more and more appreciated, as is indicated by the increasing number of such books drawn daily, showing a steady and satisfactory progress in the character of books withdrawn. There is no single branch in all the wide domain of science and literature that is not represented by one or more of the best books obtainable.
It would still be a few decades before many public libraries began to fully embrace popular fiction as a crucial element of their service to their communities. And at the Defiance Public Library, the celebration of fiction was only one of many significant transformations the library would undergo throughout the 20th century, overseen by two of the library's most influential leaders. There was Jane Small, who served as director of the library from 1976 to 1988, during a period of significant technological change.
Downstairs, the children's room is named for Jane Small. So her family's still very active in the community, and she was a director here in the 80s. And she oversaw a lot of change. I think that's when things were starting to be automated. So everybody remembers her, and there's a very nice pencil drawing of her downstairs.
But by far, the director who oversaw the most transformational period of the Defiance Public Library's history, and whose name is still widely associated with the library among Defiance residents today, is Nellie Gary, who led the library for 35 years, from 1941 to 1976.
And there's Nellie Gary, so there's a portrait of her on the wall, and our reading room's named after her. Very beloved by the community. I often use her photo as my profile photo, because I have aspirations. And our current mayor has often told me stories about how he used to mow her lawn, and how she was always very formal.
After hearing that, I could not speak with Defiance Mayor Mike McCann about his memories of Nellie Gary.
I knew Miss Gary for two reasons. One, as a student in high school in the 70s, and then my father was a service master franchise. Service master does fire and water damage restoration, residential cleaning, and then also commercial cleaning. Well, service master, when I was in high school, had the contract to clean the library. And there are times when I would help with the cleaning at the library. So that was one way I got to know Miss Gary. She just saw me as a young guy that could help her from time to time. So I did. She lived over by Defiance College in just a very little, modest brick home. And she would have me do odd jobs around her house. So I did things like clean out her gutters, mow her lawn. I remember probably the weirdest thing I ever did. I didn't know people did this, but my mom explained to me later that was just something her generation always did. She had me flip her mattress, and she would always want to pay me. And I mean, my parents, I think, brought me up right. And I would say, no, Miss Gary, you don't owe me anything. I'm happy to help you. I'd say, make a donation to the library. And then a few days later, I would get a letter from the Defiance Public Library thanking me for my $10 donation, my $20 donation, whatever Miss Gary might have thought it was worth. At the time, it might have only been $5 because, I mean, we're talking 50 years ago. So $5 was a lot of money back then. I could drive my car all week on $5 worth of gas. And beyond that, as a student, you have to understand back in my day, there was no Google, there was no internet, there was none of that. So when you had things to research, we had two places to go. At home, we had a set of Encyclopedia Britannicas, but then most of your work had to be done at the library. So all of us went to the library. And when we get to acting up in the library, which kids will be kids, I can remember Miss Gary walking over by the table, and she just tap on the table. She didn't have to say anything, but that meant tone it down a little bit, get back to doing what you're here to do. She ran a tight ship. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And that was just her demeanor. But she was never mean. She never lost her temper with anybody. She was always very helpful. The library staff was always very helpful, still is to this day. She was a librarian, but she was an educator and never had children, but she raised a lot of kids.
Mayor McCann is one of many lifelong Defiance residents who frequented the library during their youth and who fondly remember the librarian who dedicated her career to serving her community.
October 11th, 1983. After lunch, I slumped over my desk to find a present. A hardbound, color-covered 564-page copy of the Lawrenceville Stories lay on top of papers, memos, and phone messages. Paperclipped to it was a note relating that Nellie Gary, the retired city librarian, had brought it by. Seems Owen Johnson's volume was headed for the library's bargain table when Miss Gary spotted it. How she remembered I had borrowed it as a kid and loved it enough to keep it long past the 2-week loan, I'll never know. But she did, and she brought it to me. The intent here is not to weep for childhood lost, nor do I seek to pique your interest in a volume no longer found on local library shelves. Rather, I write in praise of books and librarians. I think of Nellie Gary as one of the best. A Melrose farm girl who milked cows before shelving books and was the youngest graduate of Defiance College at one time. She devoted, in the truest sense of the word, 35 years of life to a library. To at least one boy, she dispensed great words and thoughts like doses of strong medicine. And she was serious enough about her responsibilities to steer him towards certain titles and away from others. It is a measure of our time that the latter may sound high-handed to some, but I didn't question it then, and I appreciate it now, because I owe her more than a free book from my past. I am indebted for much of what I know, as well as an ability to learn more. Frank Craig, Defiance Crescent News.
She was, I'd have to classify her as a librarian's librarian. That is, she was all about the library. And, I don't know the full history, but my guess is if you went back and researched, you'd quickly find out that she took the library in Defiance to the next level. I don't know what it was like before Miss Gary, but it was quite the establishment and still is to this day. And we're blessed to have it.
Mayor McCann's guess is exactly right. Under Nellie Gary's leadership, throughout the mid-20th century, the Defiance Public Library experienced remarkable growth and expansion in its facilities and services, beginning in 1938, when the library secured state funding to expand its service area from the City of Defiance to all of Defiance County.
So they continued on the way they were when they founded. They functioned in that small building for quite a while, until 1938, and then when funding became available for statewide services. So the Defiance Library wanted to get access to the funding, so they expanded their services. They opened reading rooms in Hicksville, Ney, Farmer, Mark Center, Jewel, a lot of the small farming communities here.
Defiance Crescent News, June 8, 1938. Extension of library facilities to all of Defiance County appeared a certainty today. The proposal to establish a county library, using the Carnegie Public Library here as a nucleus, came from a Hicksville group a few weeks ago, following meetings that had been held in Hicksville with a representative of the State Library Bureau. It was suggested that Defiance County take advantage of a state law making available to county libraries the revenues from taxation of intangible property. First step in the county program will be establishment of a library center in Hicksville. This will be done, it was said, as soon as funds become available under the new budget. The plan includes extending similar services to other population centers, including Sherwood, Ney, and Jewel, and to the various school centers of the county.
So that eventually evolved into two branches that are still here today. There's one in Sherwood and one in Hicksville, and they also implemented a bookmobile service. We have pictures of the bookmobile, which are really fun.
Yeah, I think there's one on your website,
yes.
if I remember. Yeah.
Defiance Crescent News, July 1st, 1948. Increased and more efficient service by the Defiance Public Library will be started this week with placing in service of a bookmobile, or library truck. It was announced today by R.H. Sutphin, chairman of the Defiance Library Board.
Heretofore, the librarian has transported books in her own car, but service has grown to a point where this method no longer is feasible.
Mr. Sutphin explained.
The library board, for some time, has planned to reach more points throughout the county. We can do so by use of this truck, which will stop at certain designated points at advertised periods. This will reach a larger number of people living in the county. Additional service to rural patrons will be in much greater proportion than the extra expense involved.
Under Nellie Gary's leadership, by the mid-20th century, the Defiance Public Library, like so many other public libraries in America, had become a fundamentally different institution from the 19th century private subscription library from which it had originated. Its beloved Carnegie building now served as the nexus of a county-wide library system featuring 2 branch libraries. Its bookmobile extended its services to all corners of Defiance County, and vast quantities of popular fiction could now be found on its shelves. And as the library itself evolved, so did its predominant user groups. At certain times of day, the Defiance Public Library now resounded with the voices of a certain class of users who had become a major focus of public library services throughout the country. Children. In her book, Dr. Van Slyck writes about how the rise of children as a major public library user group was another turning point in American library history that was closely connected to the growth of Carnegie libraries in the early 20th century.
It is the moment in which children become a major user group in public libraries. Many 19th century libraries prohibited children. and only in the 1890s started including like a children's corner. And then you look at the plan of a Carnegie library, and fully half the main level is devoted to the children's reading room. So children are a major user group there. It's challenging though, because very few children write about their experiences at the time. So we have reminiscences, which can be very wonderful, but you have to take them with a grain of salt perhaps. But then the other thing that I ended up doing was to read reports of what librarians would say children were doing in the library. And they were often reporting what they considered misbehavior. And so I just took it as a reportage of behavior. And so a lot of the writings that we have of this kind are from cities like New York. They're primarily dealing with immigrant children. And initially, when independent of their experience of the kids, there's a lot of writing about how are we going to get these immigrant children to want to come to the library, and how are we going to do that? That never ends up being their problem. The kids that they're reporting about come in with this incredible sense of entitlement, which I love, right? They take it for granted that this library is for them. And so they come in and they refer to the librarians as teacher, because that's the only term they know for a woman who's in charge of an institution that has books and tables. And so, of course, they want their library card and they want to start using books. They also don't see a big difference between the library and the street outside. So they are often being put in charge of taking care of younger siblings, and so they just bring them into the library and they bring whatever toys they have with them, and they're making noise and they're disruptive, and so that's why it gets reported as misbehavior. I read it simply as behavior, and it tells me that these kids really just accepted that this library was for them, and they were thrilled to have an opportunity to use it in however many different ways they did use it. And there's a great story in one branch library in New York. There were so many kids. Like the librarians would hear when the bell, and they came out of school, and they would hear this crowd of children heading from the school to the library. And so they ended up putting a policeman on the door, and he would only let one kid in when another kid came out, so that they had some sort of control. And finally, the policeman, because the kids were hanging on his arms, because if they were first in line, they couldn't wait to get in, so they'd be hanging on his arms. And finally, he asked them if they would close the library half an hour earlier because his arms were so tired. And so there are some really, really great images that I have of how kids interacted with these libraries.
The Defiance Public Library might not have been quite as boisterous as a branch library in New York City, but it was not long after the opening of its Carnegie building in 1905 that the library became a favorite destination for the children of Defiance, as described by a reporter in an early newspaper feature showcasing the library's new Carnegie building.
One of the most popular rooms in the building is the children's reading room. This is fitted out with about 2,000 volumes, and from the moment of the opening of the doors, there are from 1 to 50 little people enjoying the books. Through the children, the library reaches many of the working people. There is hardly a family in the city whose children do not come to the building and get books. In this way, the members of the family who do not come to the library are reached, and the rising generation profits at the same time.
And the extent to which the library's services and programs for children had grown in the ensuing decades can be gleaned from a 1944 newspaper article describing the library's participation in that year's National Book Week, an annual program promoting books and literacy to children.
Defiance Crescent News, November 22, 1944. Defiance Public Library celebrated a successful book week, November 12th through the 18th. By following a schedule, over 1,150 grade school children from the city and from Kelly School came in groups to enjoy the book exhibits, special displays, and puppet show. Many of these pupils returned after school hours, and on Saturday, they appeared to visit again with the puppets, Lucifer and Clippo, and to make their choice from the new books which started to circulate that day. During the week, over 200 new books for children were on display. The week's circulation of 1,988 books and magazines was the largest known during the library's history. Of 520 which were borrowed Saturday, 367 were children's books. The work accomplished during this annual celebration was regarded by the library staff as proof of what can be done through the 1944 Book Week slogan, United Through Books.
Defiance Mayor Mike McCann recalls being among the many local children who made regular visits to the Defiance Public Library in the 1960s.
My mom used to take me there, and actually my Aunt Crescents worked there, so I had that benefit as well. So you would go there for things that the library would put on for kids. And then sometimes in the summer, you'd go outside and you'd lay blankets out and you'd sit out on the blanket and they would read to you. And in some cases, we got to read as well, some of the books that we were capable of reading at that age. But yeah, you bet.
And it was in the 1960s that the Defiance Public Library's collections, services, and programs had grown to such an extent that 2 additions, an east and west wing designed in a more modernist architectural style, were built onto either side of the original Carnegie building.
And they added the wings in the 1960s. You can probably tell because they've got that modernist look.
Yeah.
Very 60s.
Yes, very 60s. And they made the wings so that they could expand the children's services area, the adult stacks, and build a community room in the basement. So that was also a big change for the library. That's been the only expansion of the building to date.
Defiance Crescent News, August 15th, 1969. Expansion has been the byword at the Defiance Public Library since its founding in 1895. Today, construction is progressing on the second addition to the original building, financed by Andrew Carnegie and completed in 1905. The West Wing, or second edition, is expected to be completed by November 2nd this year. Construction was begun November 7th, 1968. The East Wing was begun October 3rd, 1961, and completed August 31st, 1962. Miss Nellie Gary, the librarian, estimates that the number of registered borrowers has increased 4-fold during the last 30 years. The circulation and book collection are also 4 times larger, she says.
The new wing's stark modernist design drew a striking contrast to the Tudor Revival style of the original building. This perceived incongruity, however, is not at all replicated inside the library.
So on the outside, it looks quite different. But when you're in the building, there is some continuity between the old building and the new. They replicated overlooking the river in the reading room, which we now call the Nellie Gary Reading Room. And they also built mezzanines against the wall on both sides. So that's kind of interesting that they built mezzanines, because in the 1960s, mezzanines were usually built in original Carnegie buildings, or they stopped being a popular thing, I think, in the 1940s. So the fact that they put mezzanines in here, I think, might have been an acknowledgement or a way to integrate it into the original building. So you can go up on the mezzanine, and if you look out the windows, you have a great view of the river.
I think there's a nice flow inside the building.
There are some, the windows are modern, of course. They aren't shaped the same way, but there's a good flow. It doesn't feel jarring when you're in the building.
In the many decades since expanding in the 1960s, the Defiance Public Library navigated the monumental technological changes of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, continually evolving its collections, services, and programs to remain relevant to the contemporary needs of Defiance County residents.
If you aren't familiar with the library, I think today a lot of people aren't sure the relevance of having a library, again, because we have these computers that we can do all this kind of stuff with. But if you go into the library and start to look around and see all the programming that they do, you do begin then to see what the relevance still is and that there is a need.
And of course, being a library, it will always remain an essential resource for good old-fashioned research. reminding us that all information is not, in fact, on the internet.
There are times where, as mayor, I need an answer to a question that there's only a couple places in the whole city could answer. One would be our Tuttle Museum, the historians there, and then, of course, the library. And they're really good about researching some of the questions that we have from time to time.
Today, the Defiance Public Library has remained such a vibrant cultural and community center for Defiance County that Director Cara Potter is now charting the path through yet another prospective expansion for the library, this time into an annex building that will be located across the street from the original Carnegie building.
We're at the very beginning stages of this. The 2 lots across the street from the library were donated by a private donor who likes to stay anonymous. And then the library purchased the abutting lot in the back to create 1 lot that's large enough to build the size building that we would need for an annex. There's been no formal architectural drawings done other than a conceptual drawing to get us started. There is an annex committee that is working on deciding what functions will be in the annex and what functions will be in the freed up space in the Defiance building. So that's all in flux right now. The process we're going through right now is a fundraising feasibility study with the Hodge Group. So we're really waiting to see what they report out to us before we make any further steps.
And to some extent that the form's going to have to follow the function. So until we've solidified what exactly we want to have here and there, we won't be able to have an architectural plan. But it's coming. It's on the horizon.
Yes. What they've talked about most recently was moving children's services to the first floor of the annex, and then also having on the second floor a large community meeting room space that would be for library programming, but it would also be accessible to local government in the area, and local nonprofits for use. They've talked about having huddle rooms for study or small group meetings. One thing that I really want to have in one building or the other is an adult literacy coordinator to help set up adult literacy program for the county. That's one-on-one tutoring rather than a classroom.
And we're really excited about having more room for our makerspace.
Yes. Our makerspace is on one of the mezzanines right now, and gets quite crowded. Because of her limited space, we haven't really been able to invest in equipment that we would like to for her because we just have no place to put it. So that's why we're looking forward to moving her into the annex.
Yeah, it's so exciting, the makerspace and the ways that they're using it. It's a place where people can come, they can either bring their own supplies or use what we have available and create and learn new skills, pick up a new hobby, connect with other people while they're doing that. It's really special.
Yeah.
And that's such a neat thing that today's libraries can offer. And it's definitely that space just isn't enough for what we want to give everybody. And so, yeah, the makerspace is part of what we'll have in the new building.
Building the annex allowed us to keep our beloved building, plus expand just directly across the street.
Yes, and make it easy to move things back and forth and access, so having the proximity to the building that we're already in is very helpful. Jump started by a donation.
Yes.
So it just all came together.
Yeah.
As the exciting plans for the library's annex facility continue to take shape, an important consideration for Potter is ensuring that the design of the annex maintains some architectural continuity with the Defiance Public Library's beloved Carnegie building.
And I talked to Cara about this briefly with their desire to build an annex. I said, my only request is that architecturally we make it fit. And so she knows that's a priority. And the minute it came out of my mouth, she said, that's a concern of mine as well. So Cara will do it right. There's no doubt in my mind.
As the Defiance Public Library looks to its future, it will also remain anchored by its past, continuing to inhabit its unique and iconic building that has stood at Fort Defiance Park for nearly 120 years, serving as a treasured community institution for generations of Defiance residents, and a living monument to the enduring legacy of Carnegie libraries in American life.
I love it, the staff loves it, the community loves it. I really feel like it's the heart of the community. Generations of families have walked up and down those front steps.
Yeah.
It's been there for 120 plus years, and not many organizations in this town can say that. And I really feel that's part of our legacy, is that we've been offering that sort of stability and continuity to the community through all kinds of changes over the past 100 plus years. And I feel like the library can continue to do that. As a library director, I don't think like 10 or 20 years in the future. I'm thinking 50 to 100 years in the future. So I'm hoping that 100 years from now, the Carnegie Building will still be used as a library. The annex will still be functioning. And if we need future expansions, the library director at that time will figure out a solution to that so that we can maintain our history here in this building.
This is a community that cares very much about its local history. And,
Yes.
and our local history offerings and services are some of the most popular things we offer. It's really something that people around here care a lot about. And so I'd imagine there are legions of people who feel very strongly about maintaining the library that they know and love.
Yeah.
So many people have special memories here, and to be able to come back into that space and the books are there and the smell is there and it brings those, and connecting to that memory of the past and seeing your kids and your grandkids create those memories, and you can all share that. I mean, what's better? I got goosebumps.
Yes, you do. Let the record show.
So I think that the United States has one of the strongest public library systems in the world, if not the strongest public library system in the world. And it's something that I took for granted until I started traveling and doing library research in other contexts and realizing how fabulous the American public library system is. Now, some of that is architectural. I mean, some of that is that Carnegie really financed a library infrastructure that might have taken many, many more decades for individual communities to come up with. His actions, I think, helped make it seem unthinkable not to have a library, right? That any forward-looking community knew they needed to have a library. And it sort of wove that right into the very fabric of American culture. On top of that, right after Carnegie's death, the Carnegie Corporation, which was the corporate entity that he created to do his philanthropic work, commissioned a study. They hired a guy to go around and survey the Carnegie libraries in the United States and to figure out if they were functioning well and whether they would essentially continue building buildings. And the conclusion of that report was that if you have a fabulous building and a terrible librarian, you have a terrible library. And no matter what your building is like, if you have a great librarian, you have a great library. And so from that moment, the Carnegie Corporation still honored the few grants that had been made, but they moved to supporting the American Library Association, they moved to supporting library schools, they moved to bringing librarians from other countries to the United States to be able to see how American libraries functioned. And, you know, they really, really supported the library profession. And I think our librarians overall are the best in the world. They're phenomenal. And again, I took it for granted that, you know, I would just show up in a town and say, "Hi, I'm here to study your library." And the librarian would say, "I always knew that somebody was going to ask that question, so I've been saving all of these documents. Here you go." You know, really, really amazing service. And every librarian I've ever dealt with in a public library really service forward. How can I help you? What are you interested in doing? Let me think on that and see if I have sources that you don't even know you want that could be of help to you, right? It's really a thought partner. Phenomenal. I'm so grateful for that to be a part of what American life is like.
Thank you to Dr. Abigail Van Slyck, Dayton Professor Emeritus at Connecticut College, Cara Potter and Taryn Lawson of the Defiance Public Library, and Defiance Mayor Mike McCann, our guests for this episode of Storied Ground. Our voice actors for this episode were Samantha Heater, Kari Marshall, and Dylan Sickles. I'm your host and producer, Nick Pavlik. Our executive producer is Chris Pfeiffer. If you have any questions, comments, or you want to listen again, go to wgte.org/ground or wherever you stream your podcasts.
WGTE. Voices around us.
WGTE is supported in part by the American Rescue Plan Act funds allocated by the City of Toledo and the Lucas County Commissioners and administered by the Arts Commission.